They were told to close their eyes, that American soldiers would come for them in the night, that captivity meant unspeakable horrors whispered about but never spoken aloud. But when 847 German women stepped off transport ships onto American soil in September 1945, the enemy broke them, not with violence, but with something far more unexpected. They expected degradation, but got hot showers and clean beds. They braced for starvation, but smelled fresh baked bread. Greta Hartman, a 23-year-old radio operator from Berlin, whispered to the girl beside her as they marched through camp gates, her voice shaking, her hands trembling. She had spent 3 weeks on a ship expecting the worst, rehearsing prayers, preparing for an end she could not imagine. But what waited beyond those gates was not an end at all. It was the beginning of something that would shatter everything she thought she knew about the enemy, about her country, and about herself. The war had ended 4 months earlier. While church bells rang across Europe and soldiers embraced in city squares, a different kind of reckoning began for thousands of German women who had served the Wehrmacht. They were not soldiers in the traditional sense. They had worn uniforms, yes, but they had typed reports, operated switchboards, bandaged wounds, sorted mail. They were the invisible infrastructure of a war machine that had finally ground to a halt. Greta had been stationed at a communications post near Hamburg when the British arrived. The officers fled, the men scattered, but the women had nowhere to go. Their homes were rubble, their families scattered or dead. When British soldiers found them huddled in a bombed-out building's basement, no one knew what to do with them. For weeks, they were held in temporary camps, sleeping on concrete floors, eating watery soup twice daily. Then came the announcement. They were being transferred to the Americans across the ocean, to America itself. The news spread like wildfire through makeshift barracks America. The word itself felt dangerous. They had been told stories about Americans for years, brutal stories designed to steal German resolve. Now those stories would become their reality. The journey began on a gray morning in late August. Hundreds of women still in worn Wehrmacht auxiliary uniforms were loaded onto trucks and driven to the port. The smell of salt air mixed with diesel exhaust. Seagulls screamed overhead. The ship waiting was enormous, a converted troop transport with peeling paint and rust stains running down its hull. Greta clutched her small canvas bag containing everything she owned in the world. A change of underwear, a toothbrush, a small photograph of her mother and younger brother, both gone now. As she climbed the gangway, her legs felt weak. The wood creaked under her feet. Behind her, a girl no older than 19 sobbed quietly. In front of her, an older woman, a nurse who had served on the Eastern Front, stood rigid as stone, her jaw clenched tight. The crossing took 3 weeks. The ship rolled and pitched in autumn Atlantic storms. Most women were seasick for days, barely able to keep down thin broth they were given. They slept in hammocks stacked 3 high in the cargo hold, the air thick with sweat and vomit and fear. At night, in darkness broken only by a few dim electric bulbs, the women talked. Some prayed, others cried. A few tried to maintain dignity, sitting upright and refusing to show weakness. Greta lay in her hammock, feeling the ship rise and fall, wondering what waited on the other side of this endless water. The American guards on the ship were not cruel. That was the first surprise. They were not warm either. They were professional, distant, doing a job. They brought food twice daily and maintained order but did not taunt or threaten. This confused the women more than hostility would have. They had prepared for monsters. These men seemed almost bored. One afternoon, about 10 days into the voyage, Greta stood on deck for her daily 15 minutes of fresh air. The ocean stretched in every direction, steel gray and endless. An American soldier, young, maybe 25, stood nearby smoking a cigarette. He glanced at her, then looked away. After a moment, he pulled out his pack and offered it to her. Greta stared at the cigarette. This was a trick. It had to be. But the soldier just stood there waiting. Finally, she took one. He lit it for her with a silver lighter. They stood in silence for several minutes, smoking, looking at the ocean. He said nothing. She said nothing. When her 15 minutes were up, she went below deck, more confused than ever. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, someone shouted that land had been sighted. The women crowded portholes, pressing faces against dirty glass. Through morning fog, a coastline emerged. America. It looked green, impossibly green compared to the bombed-out gray landscape they had left behind. As the ship entered New York Harbor, Greta caught sight of the Statue of Liberty rising from the water. She had seen it in propaganda films, always presented as a symbol of false freedom, of American hypocrisy. Now, seeing it in person, she felt nothing but exhaustion and fear and strange numbness. The ship docked and the women were ordered to gather their belongings. They formed lines on deck, waiting. The September sun was warm on Greta's face, warmer than she expected. She had imagined America as cold somehow. But this felt like late summer, pleasant, almost gentle. They descended the gangway in single file. American soldiers lined the pier, watching. Some women kept their eyes down. Others, like Greta, looked around, trying to understand this place they had arrived at. The buildings behind the port were intact. Tall, clean, undamaged. Not a single bombed-out shell. Not one collapsed roof. The contrast was staggering. Trucks were waiting. The women were loaded into the back, 20 or 30 to a truck, and driven through the city. Greta sat near the opening, watching through the canvas flap. The streets were full of cars. People walked on sidewalks carrying shopping bags. Shop windows displayed goods. Actual goods, not empty shelves. She saw a bakery with bread stacked in the window, dozens of loaves just sitting there. Her stomach clenched with hunger and disbelief. The drive took several hours, leaving the city behind, heading west through countryside that seemed to stretch forever, fields and forests, small towns with white churches, farms with red barns. Everything looked so normal, so untouched by war. Some women dozed, others stared in silence. The enormity of what they had left behind and where they had arrived was slowly sinking in. Finally, as the sun began to sink toward the horizon, the trucks turned onto a dirt road. In the distance, Greta could see buildings surrounded by fences. Guard towers stood at intervals. Her heart began to race. This was it. The camp. The place they would be held. The place where, she had been told, their suffering would truly begin. The trucks passed through the main gate, which stood open and pulled to a stop in a large dirt courtyard. The women were ordered to climb down. Greta's legs were stiff from the long ride. She stood with others, blinking in late afternoon sun, looking around at what would be her prison. The camp was larger than she had expected. Rows of wooden barracks stretched in neat lines. The buildings looked recently painted. The paths between them were swept clean. American soldiers walked around casually, some smoking, some talking in groups. It looked almost like a military base, not a prison camp. But the fences were real, the wire was real, and they were inside it. An American officer, a woman in uniform, stepped forward and addressed them in heavily accented but understandable German. They would be processed. They would be deloused. They would be assigned quarters. The tone was matter-of-fact, neither kind nor cruel, just procedural. The women were divided into groups of 20 and led toward a long, low building. This is where it happens, Greta thought. This is where the humiliation begins. She had heard stories. Terrible stories about what happened to women prisoners. Stories whispered in the dark on the ship. Stories that made her want to pray and vomit at the same time. The door to the building opened and steam billowed out. Inside it was warm and bright. Tiled walls reflected electric light. American women in white uniforms stood waiting. Medical staff. Greta's group was directed to stand in a line. One by one, they were called forward. A medic checked each woman briefly, looking at eyes, throat, hands. No one was rough. No one made crude comments. It was clinical, efficient, almost gentle. When it was Greta's turn, the medic, a middle-aged woman with gray hair pulled back in a bun, looked at her and said in broken German, You will feel better soon." After the medical check, they were directed to another room. This was the delousing station. Greta's heart pounded. She remembered propaganda images, degrading images designed to show how enemies treated their prisoners, but what she saw made her stop in confusion. There were shower stalls, real shower stalls with curtains for privacy, and on a table near the entrance, stacked neatly, were bars of soap. Actual soap. White, clean, heavy bars that smelled of something Greta could not quite identify. Something floral. Something that reminded her of her mother's house before the war. Each woman was handed a bar of soap, a towel, and a clean cotton gown. They were told to shower, wash thoroughly, and put on the gown afterward. Their old clothes would be burned. For a moment, no one moved. This could still be a trick, but what kind of trick, and to what end? Finally, one woman, the older nurse from the ship, stepped forward and took a shower stall. The others followed. Greta found herself in a small, tiled space, alone for the first time in weeks. She turned on the water and nearly gasped. It was hot. Actually hot. Not lukewarm, not cold. Hot water streaming from the shower head, creating clouds of steam. She stood under the water for a long moment, just feeling it on her skin. Then she picked up the soap. It lathered immediately, rich and thick. She washed her hair, her face, her body, scrubbing away weeks of grime and fear and confusion. The water at her feet ran gray, then clear. Around her, she could hear others crying. Not loud sobs, but quiet tears mixing with shower water. The relief was overwhelming. The simple act of being clean, truly clean after so long, was almost painful. It reminded them of being human, of a time before war, before loss, before this nightmare that had swallowed their entire world. When Greta emerged from the shower, wrapped in the rough but clean towel, she felt lighter. Not happy, not safe, but lighter. She dried herself and put on the cotton gown. It was simple, plain, but clean. It smelled like laundry soap and sunshine. The women gathered again in the outer room, all in identical white gowns, hair wet and dripping. They looked at each other differently now, cleaner, smaller somehow, without their uniforms, more vulnerable, more themselves. From the processing building, they were marched across the compound to a large wooden structure, the mess hall. Even before they reached it, Greta could smell something that made her head swim. Food. Real food. Cooking food. The smell was so strong, so overwhelming that several women stopped walking, just stood there breathing it in. Inside, long tables stretched the length of the room. At one end was a serving counter. American soldiers were already eating at some tables, but a large section was empty, waiting. The women were directed to form a line. Greta picked up a metal tray and moved down the line. Behind the counter, American cooks in white aprons ladled food onto her tray. Potatoes. Actual boiled potatoes, yellow and steaming. Green beans, carrots, and then incredibly a thick slice of meatloaf with dark gravy. A piece of white bread with a pat of butter, and a cup of coffee. Real coffee, dark and hot. She stared at the tray. The amount of food was more than she had seen in months, more than she had eaten in a week. For the past year in Germany, meals had been watery soup, black bread that tasted like sawdust, sometimes a thin slice of turnip. This was abundance beyond imagination. Greta sat at one of the long tables with other women. For a moment, no one ate. They just looked at the food. The steam rose from the plates. The smell was intoxicating. Then slowly, one woman picked up her fork, then another, then Greta, and the first bite of meatloaf made her close her eyes. It was warm, seasoned, tasted like food was supposed to taste. She chewed slowly, afraid that if she ate too fast, she would be sick. Around her, women ate in silence, some with tears streaming down their faces. The girl who had cried on the ship sat across from Greta, fork halfway to her mouth, just staring at the food as though it might disappear. The bread was soft inside with a slight crust. The butter melted into it. Greta had not tasted butter in 2 years. She bit into the bread and had to steady herself. It was too much, too good, too impossible. She thought of her younger brother Fritz, who had starved to death in the last winter of the war. He had been 9 years old. They had buried him in the rubble of their apartment building because the cemeteries were full. Fritz had asked for bread before he died, just bread, and there had been none. Now Greta sat in an enemy prison camp, eating butter on white bread, while her brother's bones lay in German ruins. The contradiction was unbearable. The guilt was crushing. She forced herself to keep eating. Her body needed it, but every bite tasted like betrayal. The woman next to her, a signals operator from Frankfurt, whispered, "My mother would kill for this potato. How can this be?" No one had an answer. They ate in silence mechanically, feeling the food fill their empty stomachs, feeling strength return to their bodies, feeling the terrible weight of survival when so many they loved had not survived. After the meal, they were assigned to barracks. Each building housed about 40 women in double-stacked bunks. The barracks were simple but clean. Wood floors swept smooth, windows with actual glass, and each bunk had a mattress, not a board. A real mattress with sheets and 2 blankets. Greta was assigned to Barrack 7, bunk 23 lower. She set her small bag on the mattress and just stood there. The last time she had slept in a real bed was over a year ago. Since then, it had been floors, cots, hammocks, concrete. This mattress gave slightly under her hand. The sheets were rough cotton, but clean. The blankets were wool, thick and warm. The woman assigned to the bunk above her was the older nurse, Liesel, who had stood so rigid on the ship. She looked at Greta and said quietly, "I do not understand what is happening." Greta nodded. "I do not either." That night, the first night in the camp, Greta lay in her bunk, wrapped in wool blankets. The barrack was dark except for a single light bulb at each end. Outside, she could hear American soldiers talking, their voices low and relaxed. Crickets sang in the warm September night. The air smelled of pine trees and cut grass. She closed her eyes and tried to understand. This was supposed to be hell. This was supposed to be the punishment for losing the war, for serving the enemy, for everything that had happened. But she was clean. She was fed. She was warm. She was, against all expectations, still alive. Somewhere in the darkness, a woman began to pray quietly. Others joined in, the old familiar words whispered into the night. Greta listened but did not pray. She did not know what to say. Thank you felt wrong. Please help felt meaningless. So she just lay there, feeling the mattress beneath her, the blanket over her, and wondered what tomorrow would bring. The morning bell rang at 6. Greta woke from a deep, dreamless sleep, the first real sleep she had had in months. For a moment, she did not remember where she was. Then memory flooded back. America, the camp, the enemy's prison. The women rose, dressed in simple work clothes they had been issued, blue cotton shirts and dark pants, and filed to the wash house. There were sinks with running water. Toothbrushes had been provided. The simple normalcy of brushing her teeth, of washing her face with clean water, of combing her hair, all of it felt surreal. Breakfast was at 6:30. Oatmeal with brown sugar, toast with jam, orange juice, coffee. Again, more food than Greta had seen in months. She ate slowly, trying to make sense of this abundance, trying not to think about the empty tables back home in Germany. After breakfast, work assignments were announced. The women were divided into groups. Some would work in the kitchen, some in the laundry, some would do general maintenance around the camp. Others would work in fields just outside the fence, tending vegetable gardens that fed both prisoners and guards. Greta was assigned to the laundry. She spent her days washing and pressing uniforms, sheets, towels. The work was hot and repetitive, but it was not cruel. The American supervisor, a woman named Mrs. Patterson, spoke no German but communicated through gestures and a few basic words. She was neither warm nor cold, just professional. The routine settled into a pattern within days. Wake, wash, eat, work, eat, sleep. It was monotonous, but it was predictable. And in predictability, there was a strange comfort. For years, life had been chaos, uncertainty, fear of bombs and starvation, and death. Here, for the first time in so long, tomorrow would be the same as today. What stunned the women most was that they were paid. Not much, just small wages in camp currency, but they could use it to buy things at the canteen: chocolate bars, cigarettes, pencils, and paper. Small bars of soap they could keep for themselves. The idea that prisoners would be paid for their work was incomprehensible. Greta bought a small notebook and a pencil. That evening, sitting on her bunk, she began to write. Not a letter, there was no one to send letters to, but a record. She needed to document this. Needed to remember. Someday, she thought, someone will ask what happened here and I want to remember the truth. She wrote, September 28, 1945. I have been here 4 days. I am clean. I am fed. I am warm. I do not understand the enemy. They do not act like enemies. This frightens me more than cruelty would. Letters began to arrive from Germany in October. The mail was censored, read by American staff before being delivered. But it was delivered. Greta received her first letter 6 weeks after arrival. It was from a neighbor, an old woman who had known her mother. The words were carefully chosen, knowing that censors would read them, but the message was clear. Things were very bad. There was no food. The winter was coming and there was no fuel. People were living in cellars because the buildings above were destroyed. Children were dying. The old were dying. Everyone was dying. Greta read the letter sitting on her bunk after dinner. Around her, other women were reading their own letters, and the mood in the barrack was heavy, oppressive. One woman was crying silently. Another sat stone-faced, letter clutched in her hands. The contrast between here and there was becoming unbearable. That night, Greta could not eat her dinner. She looked at the plate of food, chicken and rice and carrots, and felt sick. How could she eat when her people were starving? How could she accept this comfort when those she loved were suffering? But she ate anyway. Because her body demanded it. Because refusing food would not feed anyone in Germany. Because despite everything, she wanted to live. And this realization, this selfish, desperate desire to survive, filled her with shame. The women began to gain weight. After months of starvation, regular meals were transforming them physically. Faces filled out, hair grew thick and shiny, skin cleared. They looked healthier, stronger, more alive than they had in years, and this physical transformation was its own kind of torture. To grow healthy while your family starved was a special kind of hell. The American guards noticed some, commented on it, not cruelly, just observations. You look better. You are healthy now. The words meant perhaps as compliments landed like accusations. Yes, they were healthy, while their mothers, their sisters, their children wasted away in the ruins of Germany. Greta wrote in her notebook, "The food here is good, too good. I am ashamed of every bite, but I cannot stop eating. I hate myself for this weakness. I hate the Americans for their abundance. I hate my country for its collapse. I hate everything." Despite the emotional turmoil, small moments of unexpected humanity began to pierce through the numbness. They were not grand gestures. They were tiny, almost insignificant interactions that somehow meant everything. In the laundry one afternoon, Mrs. Patterson noticed that Greta's hands were chapped and raw from hot water and harsh soap. Without a word, she went to her office and returned with a small jar of hand cream. She handed it to Greta, gestured at her hands, and said, "For you." Greta stared at the jar. It was such a small thing, but in that moment, it felt like everything. Someone had noticed her pain. Someone had cared enough to help. The enemy had shown her a kindness that her own leaders never had. She took the jar, her eyes burning with tears, and whispered, "Danke." Mrs. Patterson nodded and walked away. Another time, a young American guard, barely 20 years old, was making his rounds at night when he heard Liesel crying in her bunk. He stopped, awkward, uncertain. Then he pulled a Hershey's chocolate bar from his pocket and set it on the edge of her bunk. "I am sorry," he said in broken German, for your sadness," and he walked away before she could respond. These small gestures did not erase the larger realities, did not solve anything, did not bring back the dead or rebuild the destroyed. But they complicated things, made it harder to hate, made it impossible to see the Americans as simply the enemy. They were people, complicated, contradictory, human people. Some women tried to maintain their resistance, their loyalty to the fallen Reich. They refused to smile at guards. They worked slowly, resentfully. They whispered among themselves that all of this kindness was a lie, a trick, a trap. But their arguments grew weaker with each passing week because the trap never sprung. The lie never revealed itself. The kindness just continued. Greta found herself learning English words. Simple words at first. "Thank you. Good morning. Water, please." The Americans seemed pleased when she tried. They spoke slowly, helped her with pronunciation. It felt like a betrayal of everything she had been taught, but it also felt necessary, like survival. By November, 3 months into captivity, Greta was caught in a war that had nothing to do with guns or nations. This war was inside her, between who she had been and who she was becoming. Every day the conflict grew sharper, more painful, more impossible to ignore. She had been raised to believe certain things: that Germany was superior, that the Führer was right, that enemies were subhuman, that suffering was noble, and sacrifice was the highest virtue. These beliefs had shaped her entire young life. They had sent her to type reports for the Wehrmacht. They had convinced her that she was serving something larger, something important. But here, in this American prison camp, every one of those beliefs was being challenged. Not with arguments, not with propaganda, but with reality. The Americans were not subhuman. They were just people, often kind people. The superiority she had been promised had left her starving in ruins while the enemy lived in abundance. The sacrifice had been for nothing. Greta wrote in her notebook, "I do not know who I am anymore. The girl who believed is dead, but what replaces her? If everything I was taught was lies, then what is true? And if I accept these new truths, what does that make me? A traitor? A survivor? Or just someone too weak to hold on to what she believed?" The guilt was crushing guilt for eating while others starved. Guilt for feeling grateful for her clean bed and hot showers. Guilt for learning English. Guilt for not hating the Americans, more guilt for surviving when so many had not. The weight of it made her feel like she was drowning. Some nights she lay awake, thinking about her brother Fritz. He had believed so deeply. Even as he starved, even in those final terrible days, he had believed that the Führer would save them, that victory would come, that their suffering meant something. He had died believing that lie. And Greta, alive and fed in an enemy camp, knew it had all been a lie. Was it better to die believing, or to live knowing the truth? She did not know. She had no answer. In December, the American camp administrator arranged for the women to watch a film. They were herded into a large room with a movie screen. The guards told them they were going to see something important. Something about the war. Most women expected propaganda. American justifications for their victory. What they saw instead was footage from the concentration camps Bergen-Belsen, Dachau, the Liberation, the piles of bodies, the walking skeletons, the gas chambers, all of it documented by Allied soldiers, clear and undeniable. Some women closed their eyes, some vomited, some wept, some sat in stunned silence. Greta watched, forcing herself to look, feeling something inside her shatter completely. She had known on some level, everyone had known something. But knowing and seeing were different things, and seeing made it real in a way that could never be unknown. After the film, no one spoke. They filed back to their barracks in silence. That night, the whispered conversations did not happen. There was nothing to say. The truth was too large, too terrible, too final. Greta lay in her bunk, staring at the ceiling. She thought about the soap she had been given, the hot showers, the food, the blankets. The Americans had shown her dignity, even though she had served the regime that committed those atrocities. They had treated her as human, even though her side had treated others as subhuman. The contradiction was staggering. The power of it took her breath away. The Americans could have been cruel. They had every right to be cruel. They had liberated those camps. They had seen what had been done, and yet they chose mercy. Not because the German women deserved it, but because mercy was who they chose to be. That realization broke something in Greta, broke it and rebuilt it. She understood now why the kindness had been so painful. It was because kindness demanded recognition of shared humanity. Cruelty allowed for distance, for otherness. But kindness said, "You are human, I am human, we are the same." And if they were the same, then the differences she had been taught to believe in were lies. She wrote in her notebook that night, her hand shaking. "The enemy has defeated me, not with violence, but with soap and bread and mercy. They have shown me what my own people never did. They have treated me with the dignity that my leaders denied to others. And I will carry this shame forever. But I will also carry this truth, that the measure of a people is not in their strength but in their mercy, and by that measure we failed. Utterly and completely we failed." Christmas came to the camp in ways none of the women expected. The Americans decorated a tree in the mess hall. They prepared a special meal. They even arranged for a chaplain to conduct services for those who wanted them. The generosity was almost cruel in its kindness. On Christmas morning, each woman was given a small package. Inside was chocolate, cigarettes, soap, and a small book of poetry in German. Greta held the package in her hands and felt something break inside her completely. They had thought of them. The enemy had thought of German women prisoners and given them gifts on Christmas. The absurdity of it, the impossible kindness of it, was overwhelming. Thank you for following this powerful story of transformation through unexpected mercy. If this moved you, please subscribe for more untold stories from history. See you in the next episode.